Anyway, talking about Tisha, the thing she mentioned the most, I didn't know if we really got to it when we talked yesterday, was once was a sense of otherness. It's like, even though no one would be, call her name or actually racist or anything like that, it's just like she's still just a little feeling in there that she didn't belong, that she was just not quite the same. The other thing she mentioned is for Black people always needing to be aware of what's going on around them, more so than whites, because racism affects everything they do. They have, most of us, if we're stopped by the police, we're not going to be too happy about getting a ticket, but we're not going to be worried about being dragged out of the car or anything like that. And the other thing she talked about was the tyranny of low expectations, and how she got all what she considered backhanded compliments. And she didn't think the people were racist or making racist comments, but they just didn't expect Black people to excel, to be able to speak proper English, to be able to debate or do, whatever. And so they would give her the, how well she did, but not give the white students the same sort of compliment because it was more assumed that they could do it. So
yeah, you did really well for a Black guy.
Yeah, exactly that sort of thing. Or like the one, I don't know what's in this chapter, you're the only pretty Black woman I've ever seen, and things like that. I mean,
Yeah.
what kind of compliment is it? Very backhanded compliment, shall I say. Anyway, I picked 2 scripture lessons to start us out. And I wanted to use examples of Jesus crossing racial lines because the Jews, as you well know, did not get along with the Samaritans. So the first one I want to point out is the Samaritan woman. And I think everyone knows that story, the Samaritan woman by the well. And when she comes to get water, yes, Jesus talks to her. And of course, she's shocked because, well, first of all, he's a Jew and he's a man. And either one would really forbid him from talking to her. But he talks to her, and then he goes so far as to ask her to give him a drink. Well, that's totally unheard of. A proper Jew would never drink from the same container as a Samaritan. They would consider that very unclean. And I think what Jesus was saying is these people, they're not unclean. They're just like us. And he talks about how eventually we'll all worship in spirit and truth. We won't have to worship at a certain mountain or in a certain place, but that we can all worship together and that. And that's in John 4, if anyone wants to review the what Christ had to say. I didn't want to read, I just read verses 7 through 9. The Samaritan woman came to draw some water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." His disciples had gone into town to buy food, and the woman answered, "You are a Jew and I'm a Samaritan, so how can you ask me for a drink?" Because Jews will not use the same cups and bowls as Samaritans use. And Jesus answered, "If you only knew what God gives and who it is that is asking you for a drink, you would give him, and he would give you life-giving water." And then, of course, he talks about that and of course, she wants the life-giving water. She didn't really understand right at that time what Christ is talking about. But anyway, of course, she goes back to her village and they all come out to see him, and a lot of people believe. The second story I wanted to pick out comes out of Acts 8, and that's Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, and that's definitely crossing racial lines. The Ethiopian eunuch was a convert to Judaism, or at least he did study the Jewish scriptures. And he's headed back to Ethiopia after, I think, being in town in Jerusalem for Passover and for Pentecost and that. And he's reading the Bible. Of course, Philip, first of all, the Spirit tells Philip that he needs to go to this road, that he wants him to be there. So this is where Philip goes, and this is where he sees the Ethiopian coming. And he sees that he's reading the Bible. So Philip goes up to him and asks him, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he says, "No, not really. It'd be nice if someone could explain it to me." So Philip gets up in the carriage with him, explains, it's an Old Testament, I believe in Isaiah, explains exactly what the prophecy means, and then goes on to tell him about Christ. And of course, when they come to some water, the Ethiopian stops and says, "There's water here. Can I be baptized?" And Philip said, "Of course." So he baptized him, and then the Ethiopian eunuch went on on his way, and Philip kind of disappeared. How does it put it? Then they came out of the water. The Spirit of the Lord took Philip away. The official did not see him again, but continued on his way full of joy. So obviously, even from the very beginning of the church, it was not meant just for Jews. It was meant for everybody, whatever your race was. And of course, obviously, with the conversion of Cornelius and others, it was obvious that Gentiles were also a part of that. Okay, starting in the book, chapter 4, kind of about personal racism. Did anyone have any particular comments? I was looking here, and it kind of, they're talking about the crime thing. It says, some are tempted to argue that slavery and segregation have ended, so racism is no longer a reality. And this is just not the case. It says in 2016, law enforcement agencies reported the occurrence of 6,121 hate crimes. Of these crimes, 57.5% involved bias due to race, ethnicity, or ancestry. So obviously, racism is still alive and well. It's still with us. It has not disappeared. Then she goes on to tell the story of 2 different Black people. The first one she talks about is Philip, a Black man. And she talks about about Philip's father and how full of anger he was at everything, because just a lot of rage for how his life had gone. And he says both his grandfather and great-grandfather were terrorized and brutally murdered by white supremacists, and no one was ever prosecuted for their deaths. So anyway, his father was just full of rage, and as a result was just kind of absent from Philip's life. And that kind of, Philip felt anger over that too. And his first really encounter with racist action involving him was he was at a store, and he noticed that the store clerk was very friendly, talking to the white customers and that. But when he came up, or one of his Black friends approached, all of a sudden she wasn't warm anymore. She went cold. Kind of gave him an icy glare. And instead of, when she took the money and then would give him change, she would not put it in his hand. She would just drop it on the counter. So he gets a feeling that, she thinks I'm just too dirty or defective to even touch. And this is a sort of thing he continued with. And then, of course, the last incident she really gives with him is he's in his own neighborhood. He's walking, waiting for a bus, and a police officer stops him and asks for ID. Now, he is nervous because a lot of times these encounters go wrong. They definitely, of course, don't go wrong all the time, but they do go wrong sometimes. And so it says, Phil asked the officer if he would have received the same treatment if he had been a white man walking through the neighborhood. And the officer really didn't have an answer to that. And it had come out that some woman had called saying that there was a Black man, a suspicious Black man walking around the neighborhood that she didn't know. And this is his own neighborhood. So part of it is just that people look at Black men and they're afraid. Even though there's obviously Black men to be afraid of, but there's white men to be afraid of too, if you want to look at it that way. And certainly it's a stereotype that all Black men are dangerous or a threat to you. Then the second story she talks about is Jasmine. And she grew up in Connecticut. So we're talking up north here. And she lived in a segregated neighborhood, but slowly over time, it became less and less, or more and more all Black. And so she didn't know what to call it, but that's what white flight is as white families leave neighborhoods as they become more Black, for the perceived thing that their property values aren't as great. And we talked about, on Monday when we talked about, whether some of these are really racist or maybe sometimes, but I know a lot of people move if you're in a middle class neighborhood because they get more money. They come up and they can afford a bigger, nicer house. So they move out. It may not have anything to actually do with racism. As we'll see in later chapters, in a way it kind of does, but we will get into that right now. So it's not always racist when you have these experiences, but when they have them often enough, it just seems racist. And the one thing, this is on page 51 at the top. It says parents have a desire to shield their children from the harshest realities of the world for as long as possible. This is a privilege that is not afforded to Black parents. The realities of race in America will be brought to bear on their children, whether they like it or not. Some people argue that racial injustice would just fade away if Black people would stop focusing on it or talking about it, race. It says there are many reasons why this argument does not hold up. One reason is that race and racism are regularly brought into the consciousness of Black people through no actions of their own. So anyway, any comments about the two stories she gives, the two people she highlights, or any other comments about what she calls personal racism? And these are not major incidents here. They're not like someone's calling them racist names, which of course would be another example of personal racism. But this is a little more subtle, I guess you would
individual
in that. So, because they're not being treated the way an average white person would be treated. So, ignore my phone. It's always a spam. But anyway, I need to learn how to turn off the sound on it. But anyway, that's technical ability beyond my abilities, apparently. So, or I need a new phone that I can turn off. I'm not sure which it is. So anyway, any comments or any things you'd like to talk about for personal racism or the examples that she gave in chapter 4? Anyone have anything?
I think last week I talked a little bit about the Disciple Women's Retreat a few years ago, and the keynote speaker being Black minister who's the regional minister in Tennessee, and women from the group sharing their experiences. And one thing that all of the Black women agreed about, that when they were children, their mothers insisted that you always had to be clean, you always had to smell good, it always had to be that way, because so many white people considered you to be dirty.
Mm-hmm.
And I experienced that out in Louisa one time. It was a really bad situation with a student that was not being cared for. And she had multiple disabilities, and unfortunately, we were trying to get help for the family through local agency. And unfortunately, the supervisor, and one of the evidence that we tried to show was that we were having to bathe her at school because she wasn't being bathed at home. And she would be so dirty, there would be dirt on the towel from the spit bath they were able to give her at school. And the supervisor said, well, that's because she has Black skin. I was like, what?
Good grief.
I was speechless. And this was about 15 years ago that happened. And so so anyhow, that just still makes my blood boil.
Yeah, it's hard to, I don't have any story at all about with race, but sexism. I know when my sister was in high school, the counselor, and we were in the progressive North, I might add, she said she's going to be a doctor. And he said, no, you can't be a doctor. You can be a nurse. And she said, no, I'm going to be a doctor. And he says, no, you cannot be a doctor. You could be a nurse. Now, this was in 1972. Of course, she went on to become a surgeon. But anyway, the point is, some people, they're way behind the curve, shall I say, on, what's people are able to do. And I think a lot of times people, you think for the longest time in baseball and in let's say football, they did not think a Black was smart enough to be quarterback. So no matter how many other blacks you may have had on the team, the quarterback was always white, because blacks just did not have the ability to be a quarterback. Well, that's obviously not true, that has been, proven now. And the same thing, when they didn't want blacks in baseball was because they were inferior players, which of course was not the truth at all. It was actually a lot of times the very opposite, the opposite of that. But and I think that's just sports, but there's a lot of other jobs that people just didn't think blacks are smart enough to to do. They thought of a black engineer or a black scientist would have been out of most people's thinking, 20, 30 years back.
My parents, when they were at Chesterfield Heights, became friends with a couple early on. This is, going back a few years. And what I always found so remarkable was that it was a husband and wife and about the same age group. So we're talking, long time back. And the wife during the 1950s had become like a physicist. And I just always marveled at that, how incredibly difficult that must have been. And she was very shy and humble. And, if you asked her to talk about it, and I would always ask her, like, wow, how did you, not that I was surprised that she could do it. I was surprised that she overcame the obstacles that she must have faced to do that.
Yes.
My first job out of college was with the Extension Service in South Carolina. And we worked a lot with the youth groups, the 4-H clubs. And come spring, if they were interested, they could get like a 50 or 100 baby chickens to raise. Well, what they forgot to tell this poor little city girl was that come fall, you had to go out and give worm pills and vaccinate them chickens. Well, I didn't know a thing about vaccinating chickens, but we had the nicest black county agent in Richland County. It was Columbia, South Carolina. Well, dear old Charlie Brunson said, well, I'll go with you and vaccinate those chickens. I said, wonderful. And the county agent came up to me, the white dude, and he says, Chris, you can't be seen riding around the county with a black man in your car. This was early 70s. I looked at him, I smiled, I said, I can so too if he's gonna vaccinate them chickens. But I'm not colorblind, but it never dawned to me that that would have been inappropriate. He was willing to help me and I was willing to let him.
So did the two of you end up going out together?
Oh yeah, he rode in my car.
Did
I
he?
drove, he rode. I had the 4-H kids chase down the chickens. I handed them the pill and Charlie vaccinated them.
Did he experience any repercussions?
Not that I know of. I never saw anybody that I knew or didn't know, or, we would just ride and there was never a problem that I was aware of, and there was never one for him. But we were going out onto the farms with people that were used to seeing animals, and they were all white farms, so maybe they weren't used to a black agent out there. That was the last time I gave chickens out.
In the 1950s, probably the late 50s, my sister is 10 years older than I, and she had just graduated from nursing school, and they put her in charge of an annex off of a floor. I think it had maybe 8 beds or something of that sort. And there was a nurse, African-American nurse that worked for her. And you always referred to people as Nurse King. I don't know what Nurse King's first name was, but you you know, you couldn't call her by her first name. You had to call her Nurse King. And my sister was going to take me to an amusement park when she got off work. And it was on the other side of town, and my sister didn't have a car. And so Nurse King had a car, and she was going to give us a ride and drop us off at the amusement park. But we had to sit in the back seat of the car, my sister and I, because it would not be acceptable. And this was Nurse King talking, that you know, my sister could get in trouble by sitting in the front seat of the car. So she was happy to take us, but we needed to ride in the back seat of the car.
No,
And
Joe,
you were the chauffeur?
Yes.
Right. Right. Wow.
part of that, Joe, I hear the racist aspect of that pretty strongly, but what I also heard was referring to Nurse King, and I'm not quite sure that wasn't something that was a respectful thing, because I know Susan's mother was a nurse, and she, as the time went on, and nurses that we know today wear colorful clothes and jumpsuits with polka dots and horses on them and one thing and another. And she referred to herself as a kept nurse. And she said, and when that transition was happening, patients didn't want one of those people in a flowery jumpsuit. They want a cat nurse. And that, to her, that was a real nurse, not one of these play-like people. So I think beyond the racist thing, it might have also been a term of respect.
I hope it was. I hope it was that you could not be on a familiar enough basis that you could call someone by their first name.
I think some things, I think the story, Chris, you were talking about, you said you didn't think there were any repercussions for Charlie, but you don't really know. I think some of they probably just got so used to these sort of things happening that they just kind of didn't think about it, you know, anymore. I don't know. Hopefully no one gave him any, you know.
Were you, Chris, were you in a county car?
No, I was in my personal car.
Okay.
This was back in Columbia, South Carolina, back in the early 70s. Late 60s, early 70s.
Yeah.
But I've worked with, through extension service and food service, janitorial, I've always worked with Black people. Some good, some bad, just, you know. You
Same
treat
with
me
mine,
nice.
some good, some bad.
But my thing is, you don't have to like me. You only have to be professional, polite and professional while we work together. That was my only requirement. But I've had, through work situations, I've had some good friends that were Black. It's hard to keep up with them when you get outside of the work environment sometimes, but my neighborhood over here is pretty mixed in some ways.
Yeah, my neighborhood we have a few Black people who live in the neighborhood, but they're definitely way in the minority. There are not very many. Well, the next chapter, chapter 5, I think is going to have a lot of discussion. This is more about institutional racism, or what they call systemic racism. Starting on 56 here, it says, racism is embedded in our culture, values, expectations, laws, and institutions. In other words, racism is structural and systemic racism. And then she goes on to give some examples, which I was unaware of. I thought the New Deal and that I didn't realize Blacks were excluded from that. I did not realize that the GI Bill for education and that Blacks were pretty much excluded from that. I really did not know that. So what they're saying by systemic racism is these things that have happened in the past. People, they may not be the law anymore, and maybe no one does it, but it put them so far back that it's hard to catch up. and made it hard for them to buy homes. And homes is how you build wealth. And that's why there's such a big wealth gap between blacks and white. So when you're not really allowed to buy a house for all these various, redlining laws, the ones they wouldn't give them a loan, then the fact that you end up segregating your neighborhoods, and that's why most neighborhoods are segregated still today, even though it is illegal and they can't do it legally anymore. People aren't always able to move, and their houses are often, even the same size house is worth less in their neighborhood for just it being in their neighborhood. And so that makes it harder to build wealth because of these things that went on in the past that still have a great effect because they're put so far back. It is hard, very hard to still catch up. And when we were doing this, there was I wasn't going to read her example, but I thought I'd read something from the Richmond Times-Dispatch about this very thing on housing in Richmond. Zoning and master plans adopted throughout Virginia in the 20th century, now we're not going back to the 19th century, this is 20th century, promoted racial segregation in housing and played a direct role in growing the wealth gap between Black and white residents, according to a new report. Although explicitly racist zoning laws are now a relic, their effects linger, and present-day land use policies perpetuate segregation by race and income, according to this report. And one of the things they would do had to do with zoning laws. Where most whites lived was zoned for single-family homes with a minimum lot size, and it could just be a single-family home, and it was zoned residential. Whereas in the Black neighborhoods, they didn't have these restrictions, but it was zoned industrial. So you end up with them having neighborhoods where big industrial chemical plants or whatever can be built in their neighborhood because it's an industrial zone. It says the Supreme Court did rule racially segregated zoning unconstitutional a few years later. So here we're talking the, I guess, early 1920s. But cities and counties turned to other tools to achieve the same ends. And that was part of what I'm talking about, the zoning laws. So what happened is when you're not given access to credit and these other things, you can't afford a lot, the minimum size lot that's in the area zone residential. So it just keeps building. And this is one of the reasons why most our neighborhoods are still extremely segregated from these old past things that happened during Jim Crow and even afterwards. It says federal redlining of neighborhoods limited African Americans' access to credit and by extension, home ownership. Federally insured loans that funded the construction of major suburban communities after World War II typically came with the explicit condition that African Americans did not buy into the development. And racial covenants were written into deeds forbidding property owners from selling their homes to non-white buyers. And this is, I'm talking 20th century, I'm not talking ancient history here. Combined with other barriers, the housing policies ensured that Black families would not be able to grow their wealth at the rate that white families could for decades. So the wealth gap between Black and white households exists to this day, and home ownership remains the primary driver of it. It says that when you talk about families' net worth, this is in 2016, says a typical white family's net worth was about $171,000. And it's about 10 times that of the typical Black family at just $17,000. The Fair Housing Act in 1968 outlawed racial discrimination in housing, but cities and counties throughout Virginia are more racially segregated today than they were 50 years ago. And so what has happened is the people, the county or Richmond has hired to do this report, they're going to come out later this year with a report with recommendations of what can be done to correct it. The only ones they added here that are being tried, and they said they're going to be looking at it, is in Minneapolis and in Oregon. They've eliminated single family zoning in recent years. So they're going to see what kind of effects that has and if that helps solve some of the problem. So that was one thing she's talking about, systemic racism, these things that are been built into the system. I was listening to a talk earlier today, and part of it is too, even though a lot of these laws are on the books that prevent it, they're not enforced. And so that's another problem. You know, they have, well, good grief, Civil Rights Act was that 1964, 65 when that passed?
Mhm.
And
Before.
four, okay. And obviously, a lot of that is not enforced, you know, because there's still a lot of discrimination going on. The other two things she talked about besides housing, her other example were schools. And I think this is pretty obvious to everybody. Part of the reason that the schools in Black neighborhoods are not as good is because their property is not as expensive as other property. Their taxes are lower. And because there's lower taxes, because property taxes mainly support the schools, they do not have as much money in the schools that a wealthy suburban white neighborhood would have. And I think we see that in the city schools. Of course, part of white flight caused a lot of it too. As soon as they integrated the schools, a lot of whites left, went to private schools or whatever. And so that, of course, also exacerbated the problem. So when you have the schools aren't good, you still can't get ahead. You're starting, you know, you're starting behind everyone else because you're not getting the same education that a lot of white children are. And she said that if you get truly integrated schools, a lot of Black children do a whole lot better. And she said it's not because they're with white children, it's because the facilities are so much better when they're going to these schools, and therefore they're able to get a better education. And the third thing, and then I'm going to let y'all talk, that she mentioned is the criminal justice system. And one thing, this is on page 62, it says in Washington, D.C., for example, some estimate that 3 out of 4 young Black men can be expected to spend time in prison. And the personal impact of arrest and conviction for a crime cannot be overstated. In many states, it means losing the right to vote forever, not to mention the impact on the ability to secure employment, housing, and government assistance. So once you go through all this, then you have all these other barriers into people don't want to hire convicts. And then I also didn't really know this. They said that the war on drugs started at a time when rates of drugs offenses were on the decline, and I didn't really aware of that. And then they make differentiations. You know, crack cocaine was seen as inherently as much worse than regular cocaine. So you have a lot of people being imprisoned for that who, if they were doing regular cocaine, would not have been imprisoned. And that. So anyway, so a whole lot of young Black men that are in prison, a lot of them for crimes like possessing marijuana, where oftentimes a white person who can get better representation and other things, you know, would not go to prison for this. So any comments on systemic racism?
Henrico County Public Schools was a pretty classic example for a long time of the disparity. The predominantly white West End schools, and you know, the whole time I've lived in Richmond, I was pretty much aware of this. The West End schools were much better equipped, much nicer schools than the East End of the county. And they came under a tremendous amount of criticism, about 10 years ago, I guess. And so some things were being done to try to even things out. But, you know, for a few years ago, I was subbing in different schools as a school social worker. And the disparity between the West End schools and the East End schools, as far as the space that they have, the resources that they have is still pretty evident. It's still pretty evident.
Well, I know working at Red Elementary, for instance, when I had a group of, they were actually advanced students in math that I was working with, although that really didn't work out well, but there was no place to go. There was no place to meet with them. There was no extra room. You really couldn't meet in the cafeteria. It was too noisy. You meet in the auditorium, but then you're sitting in rows. You're not really around where you can talk. You get on the stage. There's no good place. And then, of course, I can't keep discipline, so they were running wild. So I told them, that's too many students. I can't handle that many students. But anyway, there just isn't the space, to do this stuff. So, and I think it's more too than just the monetary, although I think that's huge. You take a school, I ran the concession stands at Midlothian High School for 5 years. And a lot of the things for the sports things, the parents have to raise money for them. And like for band parents, have to raise money for a lot of that. And because the county doesn't provide for it. Well, when you're in an area that has wealthier parents, you're going to be able to get more money donated to be able to get these extra things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get in other neighborhoods. So you also, I think, get a whole lot more parent. Robius Elementary, my kids went, there were parents up there all the time. I mean, parents up at Midlothian High School all the time helping out, doing various things. My son was mortified that I went, but that's his problem. And a lot of them in other lower kids, a lot of times those parents have to work all the time. They don't have the time to volunteer and don't have the option of being a stay-at-home mom, and being able to volunteer and do these things. A lot of them come into the schools not even being able to speak English from where they come from. And I think about, not even concepts of colors and various things like that. Whereas I look, Jennifer went to kindergarten knowing how to read. She wanted to learn how to read, so I taught her how to read. So going to kindergarten, she already knew how to read. They knew all their colors, all their shapes, all those other things, so that their kindergartens don't have to start way back there. They can start further ahead than you could in places that are disadvantaged. Plus you get the parents, most of them are a lot of them college educated, so they push the education. They make sure their kids do the homework. They're there going over their math tables with them and the other things that they need to do and their spelling words and things like that so that they can succeed. And a lot of times you have ones, well, especially if you have the parent who can't even speak English, they're going to have a hard time helping their child with their schoolwork. Or jobs don't provide them the time to do this. So it just it's a vicious cycle. It just is. And I have no idea what the answer to this is, but something really needs to be done.
Chesterfield's very much like Henrico, wherein the West End has the better schools and the eastern end of Chesterfield has the more challenging schools. I actually read something somewhere in all the things I read that if you look across the country, the better homes and better schools are always in the West, and the poorer situations are always in the East, because from 30 to 60 degrees latitude, the wind blows west to east. So all the factories blow from west to east. So they're positioned such that they blow from the good homes. The bad homes are east of where the water's flowing, east of where the wind's blowing. So they get the wind pollution, the water pollution, and they have other issues and poorer land values and just.
And they're probably zoned for industrial. So that's why a lot of those things are found there.
Well, I didn't know that till you just said that. I can't imagine why it would be zoned industrial when it's clearly residential places, but I guess that's so the land value could be
devalued.
Yeah, devalued. I do know when they made school board meetings public and board of supervisors meetings public, I think the whole point of that was to stop the hiding of how they are doing things. But I know in the Cosby School District, there's no government subsidized housing and there's no trailer park. So they're having private meetings somewhere because they have not approved anything to mess up the Cosby district. No government housing and no trailer parks, and Midlothian has both, and therefore Cosby scores have overtaken Midlothian, and people have moved from Midlothian to the Cosby district because of that. We even had a baseball coach leave and go there, and had his son transfer for the specialty school from James River to Cosby, and it's like, what?
Well, out in Louisa, when the population had grown enough, they needed to build a new elementary school. And so there's a country club in the town of Louisa, and there's a housing development around it. And the country club is, and that housing development literally are just about a mile and a half from this one school, from one of the older schools. But so when they built the new school, the country club got zoned into the new school, even though it was 20 minutes away.
I've been sitting here for 20 minutes thinking about a country club as the starting point, and so you've really triggered off a whole bunch of things here. If I had a spreadsheet and could make some columns, so let's put all this discussion, first column, in the context of this book, Black, White, which I haven't really read, but the black and white issue and racism. So I don't want to lose part of that. But everywhere across the column, I'm thinking of poor people in Appalachia who have the same kind of situation.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of country clubs that charge you $100,000 for membership. Well, who's going to join that? Not me. And and maybe some of you do. I don't mean to insult anybody, but there are certain things that are set up that many people are not going to be able to pay $100,000 or whatever it costs to get into one of these deals or whatever. So if I draw that line across there, it keeps coming up. So the problem we seem to be addressing is black and white, but the problem is really socioeconomics.
Yes, I mean, it does affect not just, and they even say in their book, they're not saying it does not affect other people. They're just talking about the actual effect of racism on in their experience and the experience of people that they know. But that is true. It's just poverty wherever it is, your schools are not going to be as good.
So we address that. It doesn't make a difference if you're black, white, green, or blue. You're still stuck in the same bunch of stuff that's keeping you down. And one of the things you mentioned here, which is a little sideline issue, but I don't know where all this money goes. Everybody's kissing babies, and education's always the most important thing during an election. And every year, every school teacher I've known, and many of you are sitting here right now, is out begging for pencils and erasers and coloring books and so forth because you can't get them through the school. And so something's rotten in Denmark, as they say,
I remember 20 some years ago when Bud and I were at VCU, it was so bad. What the teachers would have to do is that we were almost ready to put it in our will that when we die, we want every teacher at VCU to get a box of chalk. Because they were having to go out and buy their own pencils and paper and chalk. Chalk would not be provided. Now we don't even have to worry about that anymore. They don't even have hardly any chalkboards anymore. But
Oh. Well, Bud, I would disagree with you a little bit. Socioeconomic is definitely an issue. But I'm middle class and upper class blacks still experience a good amount of racism. Like the story of Phil and the neighbor calling the cops because he was walking down the street, and she just assumed that a black man walking down the street had to be a criminal.
I don't disagree with any of that. I really don't. I mean, I've known some professors, administrators, high-level people at VCU who have gone through the same stuff, driving home, get pulled over for a taillight being out, slammed on the ground, handcuffs on, and these are doctors. I mean, smart, well-educated, high-earning people, and they're treated like they just came out of a Hell's Angel fight or something.
Right. Socioeconomic issues definitely compound, and they intertwine. Yeah, I think.
Well, I think the thing what they're talking about on systemic racism, the way I came to understand it from reading the book is, even though the laws right now technically are equal and no one should be being discriminated against, because of the historic discrimination in the past has put them so far behind that even with fair laws, which often aren't enforced, they're still way behind, and it takes it's really very, very hard to catch up. Now, obviously people can, because there's very successful Black people and others in that who've overcome, and there of course successful white people have overcome extreme poverty, to get where they are. So it is possible, but I think some of those are extremely, really hard driven people, and not everyone is real hard driven. And the idea is to try to make things fair for, the normal average person to be able to get ahead and to succeed, not just, so the systemic racism is not saying that, because there's nothing racist really about our Declaration of Independence for the most part. It says for all people, but it wasn't enforced. The same with a lot of the other things. And now that, with the Civil Rights Act, all these things were illegal, but of course, obviously, a lot of it still went on. It was not being enforced. And so that's what they mean by it.
Jamie, the way they got, and you would know this as a history major, isn't the way they got around that is by saying Blacks weren't people. They dehumanized them. They weren't people. Remember they didn't count as human votes. Like it was 3/4, 3/5.
Yeah, but you know what? Do you know why that was? That was so the South could not outvote the North. If they could count all of their slaves as a whole person, there would have been a bigger population, and they would have been able to outvote the North. So the compromise was to make them 3/4 of a person.
Wow, I did not know that.
And they didn't want to count them as not any person, because then the South really loses out there, because a good bit of their population was slaves, and that. So some of these compromises, when you go back, it's really
Ugly.
ugly. Yes.
Yeah. Am I the only one that grew up in the towny country environment where if you were the poor white kid in the country, you were treated very differently at school from the the towny group that went to piano lessons and cotillion and all that. And then, but I even realized,
I grew up in a city environment, but what divided us was that there was an 8-lane highway and a series of railroad tracks that ran east to west. If you lived south of the tracks, you lived south of the tracks. And then if you lived north of the tracks where the estates were, that was completely different. So there was definitely discrimination, but not along the lines of what you might typically think of, white, Black. It was definitely based on where you lived.
yeah, well, the same where I grew up too. It was socioeconomic, but I still realized even if I was in the lower white group, I still had more than Blacks around me.
Richmond had the same thing with the James River. When we moved to the south side, a lot of people thought they needed a passport to come over here.
Well,
Remember the bumper stickers?
The funny thing about that, when Bernie and I were transferred here and we moved in, our real estate agent actually told us we would be happier south of the river because he was a Yankee than we would be at the north other side of the river, because they were just so cliquish over there, and you weren't, newcomers were not accepted in that. And the first impression I had of Richmond when we moved here was that they were still fighting the Civil War. And that, so
the war of northern aggression. Come on, girl.
Yeah,
so,
That's what my history book said.
That's right. It wasn't the Civil War.
well, I will say, even in Texas, we were not taught that. We were taught it was Civil War and slavery was the cause of the war. So
That's what I was taught in North Carolina. And so moving to Richmond, the first time I heard Dixie played at an outdoor concert and how the crowd reacted, I was like, what the is going on?
well, I didn't think anything
never
about
seen
Dixie,
that
because
in
that was
my
our fight song in my high school. But you just, as you learn more things and talk to people, you come to realize how some of these things affect other people. You know, they don't affect you necessarily, and you try to rethink, how you think of certain
We
things.
we came to the fan. We lived in the fan. We were at VCU, and I came here in '73. Well, I was on North Morris Street, which is a block from Main Street, and I was told, you'll be all right here, but don't ever cross Main Street. And when Cindy was first at the church and Don was still living, we prowled around at night, all hours of the night, around the fan and everything, and they would not even begin to think about driving down the fan. So it's all kind of relative.
There's a lot of people in Chesterfield that will not go into Richmond City at night to eat at a restaurant. A lot of people.
Yeah, well, I'm a little more cautious than I was when I was 30.
Me too.
I can't run anymore, for one thing.
Well, the next point of our discussion is white privilege. Now then, I do not like this term because I don't think it really describes what they mean by white privilege. As she says, the term privilege does not refer to a person's wealth. That a white person has privilege does not mean that they will never be poor, that they will never suffer, will never be fired from a job, or will never end up in jail. Privilege just means that if a white person encounters these life events, more than likely it will not be because of the color of their skin. So that they have automatic social, political, and economic advantages in society because their skin color is not held against them. So basically that's what they're saying with white privilege. Not that it made you rich or it'll make you rich or anything like that, but all the hardships or anything you've had to face, Black people face all those same hardships plus being Black and the way Blacks are treated, which whites do not experience. And laws and things that held, Blacks back and things like that, that would not ever affect a white person. And so somehow privilege doesn't, I don't know, I think that they need to come up with a better word. I really do not
Advantage.
like that.
How about advantage instead of privilege?
I think that would be better, a white advantage, because I think that to me makes a lot more sense. It's not like people are overtly giving it to you. It just happens because you're white. It's an advantage that you have in this society because you are white. And
I think maybe it's, we're trying to look at it in positive term. Privilege, advantage are both positives.
mm-hmm.
I went to some talking sessions in our community here in Fayetteville that addressed white privilege. And what the Black people were saying was they grew up when they would walk into a store, people would look at you suspiciously. They would keep their eye on you thinking that, what are you going to do, steal? I mean, I remember as kids, most kids go through some of that. But as you grow older as a white person, that doesn't happen anymore. But if you, for a Black person, regardless of your age, you walk through a store, people look at you and people are wondering in their minds, is this person going to steal something? Are they going to cause trouble? And that is in a sense why we are privileged. We don't have to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to college, you have to far exceed your white neighbors probably to go into the same college, just because you're Black.
Well, didn't Black people shop in Black grocery stores and go to Black barbers and go to banks run by Black people like Maggie Walker? The reason she had a bank was so she could loan money to Blacks who couldn't get loans from white banks. I think a lot of Black people got around the limitations white people put on them by economically dealing with Black business owners where they could accrue some financial advantage. Or am
Sure,
I
and
wrong
I
about
think,
that?
no, I think that's correct. I think other nationalities have, I mean, the Chinese have done that. The
Mhm.
Irish did that when they came into the country. You know, that has happened a lot in our society. You know, look in, if you go down to Laredo, Texas, that city is almost entirely Mexican American or Mexican complete. I mean, and so what they have created Mexican communities in America just so they can be equally treated. And you know, I as a white person, when I go into Walmart in Laredo, I'm feeling like an outsider. I don't feel that people are looking at me suspiciously, but I definitely feel being an outsider.
Well, don't big cities have like, don't San Francisco and LA and New York and Chicago have a Chinatown and so the people still go to where they're most comfortable.
One of the things that I think affects us as Christians is looking at churches. What's the old adage that 11 o'clock is the most segregated hour in America on Sunday mornings?
Right.
One of the issues with that, of course, my congregation down here had a number of Black families, but this is favorable. We are an exception to the general rule because of Fort Bragg. But I don't know how many of y'all have ever been to a Black church. And if you haven't been, I recommend going, but be prepared to stay for a while. They normally last 3 hours or
I
more.
know how to say hallelujah.
You know,
Well,
that's
yeah.
funny that you say that because Joe Satoli, he was a co-worker of Bernie's who was Black. He married in a Black woman who was a Baptist and went to church. And he asked Bernie, he says, how long do your church services last? And he says, well, about an hour. He says, good grief, ours go on for 2 or 3 hours. And how many times do they pass the communion plate? And Bernie said, just once. He says, they pass it around. If it doesn't look like it's enough, it goes around again. So it is a different, it is different. So
Yeah.
On this, on the white advantage or white privilege issue, something that happened to me that I was part of this fall as school started, in response to the demonstrations, the Black Lives Matters demonstrations last spring and summer, the administration at Hermitage went through and did some serious statistical analysis as far as the racial and gender makeup of the different honors programs in the school. And to see those those pie graphs, those pie charts of the breakdown was eye-dropping. It was amazing.
But you know, that goes back to the segregated neighborhoods and the poor elementary schools, so they don't get the background to
Right.
get the information they need to be able to be in these programs when they get older.
Right. If you were a white female, you had it made. You know, they made up the majority of the top honor programs were white females. If you were a Black male, you were, it was, Kitten, you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I was in charge of the SOL programs. The hardest SOL in Virginia is geometry, and Black male special ed. I mean, I supervised math and science at Midlothian High School, and the kids I most had to work with and pull out of electives and send them to, we hired special SOL review teachers, was Black males also in special ed. That's the SOL demographic that will keep you from making AYP, annual yearly progress, which they don't even have anymore. So it is so broken down now by sex, by culture, by if you're special ed, not special ed. I mean, we knew exactly which group had the highest failure rate and where we need to put our resources to get them to pass. And Black males in special ed could have given 2 figs about geometry. You know, these boys wanted to do plumbing and carpentry, and they could have cared less. I know you use some math in carpentry and all that, but you get my point. We're pushing them in this track when they want to be over here being a barber or a musician or something else. And it was very frustrating, very frustrating.
Well, I think we made a big mistake by not actually, and I'm not just talking for Black students at all, I talk vocational training and education, because
That's changing.
That's,
I'm
yeah,
glad, because those are, I mean, what do you pay a plumber and stuff like that? Those are good jobs that you don't have to pay $100,000 to go to college to get, you know.
As of about 8 years ago, Chesterfield has 2 tech centers now, and a day shift and a night shift. So that is changing.
but what really stood out when we, we're looking at all these statistics, the whole faculty looking at them, was the subtleness of teachers looking at who would be appropriate for these programs. Who
Kit,
could be
uh,
offered.
we're talking about some people want to be carpenters and so forth. It made me think of something. Remember Mary Kay? I guess that business still exists, the pink cars and,
Mhm.
and whatever. Mary Kay said that when the plumbing's broken, the most important person in your organization is the plumber.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Good jobs out there, and I don't mean to sidecar this discussion.
Oh, absolutely. They almost canceled the plumbing program when I was at Midlothian. They almost canceled it. They didn't get enough applicants. Counselors weren't directing kids toward it, and kids didn't want to get dirty. I'm not doing that. I'm not crawling around in mud under a house.
Well,
Kathy, I think those demographics, you were at was that at Hermitage?
This year.
Yeah, well, I started my career at Hermitage back in 1980. And I think those demographics would be, numbers would change, but they'd be comparable at many, many high schools.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
Many high schools. Well, have y'all been keeping up in the paper with the Thomas Jefferson School for Math and Science in Northern Virginia? It's like 70% Asian kids, and the minority, the Hispanics and Blacks, want their fair number of spaces, and the whites are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. If we increase Black and Hispanic spaces, the whites are going to get marginalized. So now there's a huge brouhaha up there about the kids that the selection process for the #1 select high school in the country, which is that Math Science High School in Northern Virginia.
You mentioned the Asian kids. Are getting a little bit off topic here, but quite some time ago, I don't remember where I got this information, but Asian children have a very high suicide rate. And it's because of the pressure, the extreme pressure that their families put on them to become absolutely top dog in everything. There's math and science and
Music even.
so there's a lot of these Asian students are very bright. It just kind of makes me think I'd play the pipe for the School of Engineering and their graduation ceremony. I haven't done it for a couple of years because of this COVID and so forth. But when I look at that graduating group of people in the School of Engineering, maybe I'm prejudiced, but it looks like the majority is of some color, multinational people. I mean, there are people there from every country you can imagine. And so a lot of
Well, I think, these,
you want to break out of that, and they're really trying hard, and there's a lot of pressure for them to do that.
but you need to start really young at the elementary school so that they're prepared, so that they're ready to go. Because just putting them into one of those schools, if they're not ready, unless they have special help, they're not going to do well because they're not prepared for it. So you really need to improve the schools.
Jamie, there's a whole population that would disagree with that and say you need to start in utero and teach moms that you don't do drugs, you don't drink alcohol when you're pregnant, you eat properly, you go take prenatal vitamins and go to the doctor. There's a huge push now to even push it way back earlier than that.
Well, I think so, because, and I think in the white suburbs it's been that way for quite some time. we were told not to smoke and not have caffeine and all the other stuff when we were pregnant. So I think that's an educational process that you're right needs to be spread, spread everywhere. But my thing is, I do not want to lose my white privilege, and I am the poster child of white privilege. What I want is everybody else to have white privilege too, even if they're not white. So it's to bring everyone up so that everyone has the same advantages. And to end up, there wasn't a whole lot I didn't think in chapter 6.
There was nothing in chapter 6.
She was talking about that we white people sometimes tire out Black people with our questions and our comments, and the dread they have thinking they're going to have to talk to us because we're going to accidentally insult them, or stuff like that, or we expect the one Black person we know to speak for the entire race, and that. So I don't know if anyone had any comments on chapter 6. Otherwise, we can end there and try to get to 7, 8, and 9 next week. Any comments or anything else before we? Yes.
I would just like to know, is anybody interested in each of us doing the Peggy McIntosh white privilege inventory that they mentioned we can do for free at the end of page 5? Did anybody do it?
I tried to get on and couldn't find it.
Oh,
If you do find it, tell me how to find it. I mean, I went on the website and there was no mention of it. I clicked on the various menus and could not find it. So obviously I'm not clicking on the right place.
I'm just gonna Google Peggy McIntosh white privilege inventory, and if it pops up, I have
Well, that's true. That might be a better way to go. I went to the website and I just couldn't find it. So
I'm just gonna Google it, and I wrote all your names down. So if I find it, I'll send it to you. I just wondered if we'd be surprised by any of the questions or the results. I love surveys. I love doing, Myers-Briggs and all that stuff. I love those things.
they're not always accurate though. Myers-Briggs thinks Bernie is introverted. So
Well, Myers-Briggs does have different definitions for things too, so.
yeah.
Yeah.
Bud, what was your comment?
Kitten can do my survey. I hate surveys.
I love doing them. I like seeing whether they're accurate or not, and what kind of questions they ask.
Well, I figure I'll score high on the white privilege. I grew up in an upper middle class family in a very nice neighborhood with great schools, and
I think everybody tries to lift themselves out of that. Black people, Asian people, Hispanic people. I think everybody tries to push the next generation a little further along.
I think this generation of our kids is one of the first that probably won't do better than their parents.
I would agree with that.
They may do as well, but but the problem, what she's saying with systemic racism is, yes, Black parents want those same things for their children, but because of the obstacles and things that are put in front of them, it's very hard for them to do that.
Yeah.
So, not that it's impossible, because obviously you can find lots of examples of very successful Black people who, can't say they did it all on their own, but you know what I mean, have overcome a lot of things. And
one of the advantages of working in Louisa as long as I did was I definitely saw a lot of the second generation. I worked with the parents when they were in school, and then their children. I was blessed to see a number of families, many families, that next generation, the kids were in much better situations. The education that their children got was far superior than what the parents. There were still a lot of hurdles still to the subtleness of some of the things. Like I was talking earlier about, like the redistricting of the country club when the new school was built. And then when that new school didn't perform well, they redistrict the county again. And the country club got moved back to the school that was a mile and a half, because that school was better performing then.
Well, Salisbury's right across the road from James River High School, but they wanted Midlothian on their diploma because that's what William and Mary, W&L, and UVA recognized was Midlothian High School, not James River. So Salisbury went to Midlothian. And they're right across the street from James River, could walk there.
Yeah, Powderham did too, but we're no longer there. We're in James River now.
Yeah, Powderham was
Exactly when
grandfathered
they
in.
changed, but
I was at Midlow when that happened.
so, but anyway.
VCU and MCV joined together, RPI and MCV to become VCU. For years and years after that, the medical college wanted their MCV diplomas. They would not accept a VCU diploma
Wow.
because MCV was known, had a reputation.
That was an ongoing battle. I know one doctor that, they called him up, they graduated years ago, and they said, "Would you like to VCU?" And he said, "No, I don't know, but hell no."
Well, I still say MCV when I'm referring to anything medical,
Yeah.
and VCU if I'm referring to educational.
Well, been around a long time. And that's
Well,
the
the
language
new
now.
VCU logo has the MCV logo on it now. So
Where they use both. Well, that's, Barton College when they changed their name from Atlantic Christian. Some of us still.
Well, I have a sweatshirt with Longwood College on it. When I was there, it was Longwood College. And somebody said one time, "It's not Longwood College anymore." I said it was when I went there. I mean, the person implied I shouldn't be wearing the sweatshirt.
Yeah, I have a T-shirt that says Barton College, and then underneath it says Atlantic Christian College, and then in small print it has the Heritage edition, recognizing both.
So
Anyhow,
Thanks,
Well,
Jamie.
I've enjoyed talking with y'all because, like I said, I don't have not that I've never met a Black person or done things, but my experience is very, very, very limited, and it's actually limited basically to professional Blacks, that are at the same socioeconomic level that Bernie and I are. So it's
Well, I grew up in a county that's over half Black, but I live in a white neighborhood. I go to a white church. I worked at primarily all 4 high schools I worked at were primarily white. So I've insulated myself really well. I know that's coming up next week. Just a little prelude for you.
So, well, it's easy to do. And when you're younger, you don't really think anything about it. That's just the way things are, and that's just the way things go. And you don't really.
Well, I'll be straight up and say, as an adult, I planned it. I mean, I checked out the high school district before we bought every one of our houses.
Oh, we did too. That's why
I
Bernie
planned
took
where I'm
the
living.
job with Ethel rather than we had a choice of moving to I think Ocala, Florida, and rural North Carolina. Well, I said there's no way anyway I was going to live in rural North Carolina. I said,
They're in rural North Carolina.
Do you remember where?
well, near their plant, so near
They're good barbecue.
Franklin, Virginia, not too far. I mean, there's nothing there. Ones at our level who have houses like that, when you want to move, no, there's no one there to buy them. It's so I grew up very, very suburban. Midland was a city, really a suburb without a city where I grew up. That's what I kind of call it. But yeah, so I wasn't going to go there. Plus, we'd have to send our kids to private school because the county schools weren't very good. And the same in Florida, they told us we'd want to definitely send our kids to private school. But Chesterfield County, if we moved in Midlothian or in this area, we would not have to send our children to private school. They would get a good education in the public school. And so we chose here.
I don't think Florida has bad public schools because they don't have smart kids. I think there's so many elderly people that move there from other places. They're just not going to pay for the tax increases to pay for them.
So whatever the reason, I'm not sure. I didn't look into it. I think it's supposed to be a really pretty part of Florida, from what I actually understand. It's horse country, I think,
Oh, it's definitely horse country.
in
I'll
that.
say
So,
that much.
Yeah, my sister lived there. She said the schools are pretty bad in Florida.
so,
They won't vote for tax increases.
mhm. so, so anyway, no, that's kind of how you stay insulated. I mean, you know, if we'd come here and the black district was the very best district, we probably would have moved in close, you know, close to there, because that wouldn't have bothered us, or at least not much, maybe a little, but we get used to it. But anyway, but that's unfortunately how things aren't. So the goal is to hopefully change things so that the black schools, well, actually, maybe there won't be any black or white schools. There'll be, you know, it won't matter what your color is. They'll be all mixed and they'll all be great schools. But we have a long ways to go to. So like I said, I'm rooting for everyone to get white privilege like I have. So that's my goal.
So next week we're doing 7, 8, 9.
That's what I'm going to try to get through. Yeah.
Okay.
Some chapters have a lot more to discuss. I figure systemic racism and white privilege, because that's in the news all the time,
Yeah.
would have a lot more to talk about. And her definition of it and how she describes it isn't how I would pick it up from the news media I hear. But I think it makes a lot of sense the way she describes it and that. So.
Well, I've been pretty open and agreeable with everything they said so far, but not 7, 8, 9. So they're pretty out there in 7, 8, 9.
So anyway, that's what we're here to discuss. I like, even if they're far out there, it's nice to know their perspective and where they're coming from and why they think. I've been listening to some stuff, the why, you know, that we support for the battered women's shelter. I gave a donation on their website, so I got an invitation to join their 23 days of racial reconciliation seminar or challenge, they call it. So each day they have something else on. So this week's been all about reparations, which has been real interesting too, to listen to and their perspective. And actually, when you listen to it, there's a lot of sense. There's a lot of stuff that actually, I used to think there's really nothing to discuss about that. That's ridiculous. But I see their point of view much more. And I think it's good if we can see other people's points of view. Even if we disagree, we can
There's
know
also
where they're coming from.
discussion,
It makes it much better to find a compromise too. You know, you usually, not always, but usually someplace in the middle is better than on either far end. Not always true, but a lot of times. And if you understand where the people are coming from, it's better. I think it's easier to find a compromise and something that everyone can live with and work to try to make things better. So yeah, I've learned a lot. It's been like I said, I've really enjoyed just getting someone's perspective that I would never hear. The people I hang out with, no one has that perspective, or anything to.
I love the biblical connections in the next 3 chapters. The biblical connections are very clear.
Yes.
And I like that.
So I like they brought it in. Some of the chapters they have, and I've tried to find some in the Bible that I thought were appropriate to, since it's a Lenten study, I thought we should have some biblical references, in the study. So
Kathy, what were you going to say?
that there's discussion now, even at the national level and in Congress, about the socioeconomic disparities and some European countries doing grants to low-income families to help pull kids out of poverty, and what a difference it's made, societally. And so there's more discussion even within some Republican circles about that. And that has, that discussion, I think, has some real ramifications for some of the things we've been talking about tonight.
Yeah.
Wow.
And the challenge is, does the grant money go to the children? That's the hard part.
Yeah,
It's not agreeing on, yes, there should be assistance. It's how do we get it to the people who need it?
Mhm.
Yeah, because the colleges that don't let minorities in have millions and millions and millions in endowment money. And yet they're screaming to the state, we need more money from the state. And they've got millions in endowment that they could use to let more disadvantaged kids who qualify in.
Well, a
I
lot of the
think
problems are due to mismanagement. I mean, a lot of city school things would be better, but there's a lot of waste and fraud and mismanagement in these really huge school districts. I always thought on the Richmond public schools, I don't know if they don't vet their superintendents, but they were constantly hiring one, keeping them a year, firing them, but having to pay them off for the 5-year contract.
5 more years.
Go buy another, pay for another one. So like paying for 2 superintendents at the same time. And I thought, what a waste of money that could be spent, so much better and stuff. And a lot of our priorities and, are obviously wrong.
And yet teachers are still having to ask for, can you buy the kids crayons?
Yeah.
I always wondered if those superintendents tried to make legitimate change and whoever didn't want it to happen and pushed them out.
I have no idea why, because my kids didn't go to Richmond Public Schools. So not that I didn't care, but I didn't care a whole lot. So I didn't really.
Yeah, I agree.
I just thought it was a shame that, so much money being wasted, and there's just a lot of overhead and a lot of unnecessary padding, I think. New York City.
I know Richmond has hired teachers that Chesterfield fired. I don't know about Henrico, but and you get signing bonuses and you make more money, and Richmond spends over $10,000 per kid. And last time I looked, Chesterfield was, do you know what it is now, Gina? It was $6,800 per kid. So Richmond spends significantly more per kid to educate them.
Yeah, do they?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I know when Buddy Westbrook's wife, the minister at Bethany, when we were there, his wife, Judy Westbrook, taught in the city, and she made substantially more than the same years of experience in Chesterfield.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, it needs to be just the same way at the major corporations, where if you come in as CEO and then you last 3 months and you decide to quit or you get fired or whatever, you don't get to keep your signing bonus. You don't get to keep, they don't have to pay out the rest of your contract. I've never understood why all of that is written into, before they hire someone. It's like when I get hired, it's right to work state. I have no rights basically at all. Why does that not extend all the way up the ladder?
Well, I'll tell you why. In the case of schools, they hire people to make change, and then because they're change makers, that's what superintendents are. And then when they come in and actually step on some toes, they get pushed out.
Mm-hmm.
It depends on what change you want to make.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the city
Who's wanting to make it?
is a whole different culture.
Yeah.
Well, folks, I need to go. So
Yeah, I've enjoyed this. I will see you all next week.